Hello. The full title to Yvonne Denier's essay in our text is From Brute Luck to Option Luck on Genetics, Justice, and Moral Responsibility in Reproduction. She begins with a passage from Chance to Choice by Buchanan, Brock, Daniels, and Wickler. As possibilities for significant and large-scale genetic interventions on human beings come closer to being actualized, we may be forced to expand radically our conception of the domain of justice by including natural as well as social assets among the goods whose distribution just institutions are supposed to regulate, to abandon the simple picture of justice being about distributing goods among individuals whose identities are given independently of the process of distribution, and to revise certain basic assumptions about the relationships between justice, human nature, and moral progress. So the claim here is that with knowledge, with genetic knowledge in particular, we're losing our innocence, that what in the past was considered the natural lottery, that what you get as a genetic makeup is up to nature, not us. With genetic interventions and in the early stages, especially diagnostic information, we have choices. And then when we have choices, we have responsibilities for those choices. She's concerned with that, with what this means. And in the end, she has some response to it, that what a just society will require some nuanced consideration of these concepts. So prenatal genetic diagnosis, PGD, is the technology that's available to us now. That is what she's most concerned with there. She begins by making a distinction between concepts of wrongful birth and wrongful life to underscore the difference in our posture relative to choice and luck. In wrongful birth, the parents of a disabled child initiate a lawsuit, typically against a physician who is accused of not performing proper genetic screening or not adequately counseling prospective parents. The essence of wrongful birth is that the defendant's negligence resulted in the birth of a disabled child whom the parents would have aborted had they received adequate medical information. In wrongful life, on the other hand, the disabled child or those acting on the child's behalf sues for being alive. In the latter case, the parents may become defendants. In essence, the child's claims that being born damaged him and that he should be compensated for his suffering and for our extra financial costs, such as special education and medical care. So the second concept is far more radical. The first is parents suing an obstetrician, say, or a genetic counselor for not giving them information that they could have used to make a decision to abort a child would be affected. In wrongful life, it's the child, him or herself, who brings suit possibly against his or her own parents for being alive, that to be alive, to have been born with this condition, is to have been injured. They're all fraught with conceptual problems there, including the person-affecting argument. She considers then the philosophical background for the uneasiness in society about claims of both wrongful birth, but particularly wrongful life. In the section, a lucky egalitarian viewpoint, she has in mind, although she doesn't mention it, I think Rawls's difference principle that lurks behind all of this, which will become explicit when we get to the section on justice and Norman Daniels' discussion. Rawls's difference principle, one of his two principles of justice, is that people ought not to be, any differences between people ought to be a matter of for which they're responsible, are matters that for which they are affected ought to be matters for which they're responsible. And the only difference between people are those then that society treats people differently would be justified by its being best for the people at the bottom of society. In this regard, she employs or discusses Gerald Dworkin's distinction between option luck and brute luck, which are in the title. Egalitarian theory, such as Rawls, requires that only inequalities arising from brute bad luck requires redress. Brute bad luck is the luck of the draw. So if we use a gambling metaphor to explain both of these, brute luck is the cards you're handed. You have nothing to do with that. Option luck is the luck of the gamble, that once you have your cards, you have some decisions that you can make. So option luck, again, is luck. You don't know what's going to happen when you play your cards, but you get to choose how you're going to play your cards. That's option luck. Brute luck is simply the cards that you get. Again, egalitarian theory requires that only inequalities arising from brute bad luck require redress. On Dworkin's view, the welfare state functions as a large insurance company. Taxes for redistributive purposes are equivalent to insurance premiums. And this makes sense because the conditions we're considering here, genetic anomalies, are devastating and devastatingly expensive. So it makes sense that they be paid for by something like a social insurance scheme. There are two kinds of appeal to luck egalitarianism. First, the humanitarianism of the view that no one should suffer as a result of undeserved disadvantages. And second, it accounts for new risks, new responsibilities arising out of increased knowledge. For example, prenatal genetic diagnosis makes us responsible for bringing into existence those with genetic disabilities, as we know what their genetic constitution will be, and then we choose to bring them to term. Resulting in questions include, what sorts of children should we be attempting to create? If we have this choice, if we can know what sorts of children we can bring into the world, what their genetic constitution will be, then we're responsible. So what kinds of children should we bring into the world? What sorts of children is it even permissible to create? The issues raised include those of preventability, responsibility, compensation. All of these move from brute luck to what formerly were matters of brute luck to matters of option luck. And then she considers conceptual difficulties of all this. In particular, concepts of nature and natural inequalities generally are understood as being beyond human control, and that they evolve with technological and medical evolution, that with science, with technology, we have new choices and therefore new responsibilities that we didn't have before. Ethically, she says, to call something natural is to imply that it's beyond our control and therefore outside of our responsibility. What's natural, when bad, is properly thought of as a misfortune, not an injustice. In egalitarian theories of justice, naturally suffered disadvantages are considered to require compensation through the distribution of social goods, say welfare payments, special education, subsidies of various kinds. Why? Because these disadvantages are undeserved. When we get to the section on justice in the book, we'll look at Norman Daniels' work on extending Rawlsian justice theory to healthcare. Daniels will argue that healthcare as a social good is different because health is required to pursue anything else that one regards as good. What's new in Denier is the argument that what was formerly a natural condition, one's genetic endowment, may soon be subject to our manipulation and distribution as a good, and therefore, paradoxically, no longer natural in the sense used here. If it becomes within our power to prevent a congenital anomaly or disease, then we may no longer regard it as a misfortune. Sufferers instead could become to be seen as victims of injustice. Notice that to regard them as such does not imply that they're harmed insofar as they're sufferers. With prenatal genetic diagnosis, there arises the notion of then responsible parenthood. She considers three kinds of interests. First, social interests. These are both economic and moral. Economically, it could be in society's interest to make parents bear the cost of having a genetically disabled child when PGD is available to them. The social pressure on parents to use PGD and to avoid the birth of an affected child could be very high. Denier argues, though, that society also has moral interests, including humanity, moral sensitivity, and the provision of the bases of equal respect. The expression of moral refinement and justice in a society would involve how it treats its congenitally disabled. Parental interests. These include emotional interests, a family's strength and capacity, and moral interests. While PGD seems to have made what was an object of brute luck into one of option luck, parents' moral seems to have made these parents' moral beliefs. For some, the diagnosis of a genetic disease will seem to immediately imply a rational choice of not a duty to terminate a pregnancy. For others, the diagnosis would produce a terrible dilemma. For still others, it might not even present itself as an object of option luck. That is, abortion may be out of the question. A genetic anomaly or disease would remain an object of brute luck for those people. We should note that this is a descriptive speculation on her part, implies nothing about how well-founded any of these three views would be. Third is the child's interest. For the child who is the result, the result of prenatal genetic diagnosis remains an object of brute luck. Why? Because it's constitutive luck. If the child is either born or not, there are no options otherwise. So if the child is going to exist at all, then the child will exist with this genetic constitution. It is, in terms of what we saw in Sparrow, a non-person affecting situation. Wrongful life and wrongful birth suits imply that an affected child's parents judged that it would be best that the child not have been born. And then as to the concept of responsibility, Denier argues that the mainstream view on responsibility makes us responsible for what we do voluntarily. That is what we want to do. This is closely related to the claim, she says, of the idea of responsibility as control. So what we do voluntarily and what we control are what we're responsible for. This is the conventional understanding. The important distinction is between what is subject to fortune and what is under our control. She believes both of these, both the idea that responsibility understood as voluntariness and responsibility as control are regressive conceptions of responsibility. A regressive control conception of responsibility implies, to quote her, that in order to be responsible for something, one must also be responsible for its causes. This, she argues, is impossible. And well, that's true, actually. Think of lighting a match. Now, it's just, what are we responsible for in lighting a match? Providing the friction. What else is required? Oxygen. Fuel, we're not responsible for the provision of oxygen. So to be responsible in terms of causes would literally make us responsible for conditions over which we have no control. Regardless, the regressive notion can lead to buck passing, lawsuits. She says the idea of genetically responsible parenthood conceives a responsibility in a backward-looking spirit. Something went wrong and must be compensated for. That is true. That has always been an understanding of responsibility, isn't it? That we still have that if this is understood in terms of justice as compensatory justice, our concern for victims. Now, victims of even natural disasters have been offended, but they've been injured, and they deserve compensation. That's the intuition behind this. She argues instead for an alternative, forward-looking account of responsibility. She distinguishes between actual and moral responsibilities because the question of responsibility for the birth of an affected child, responsible parenthood, also refers to the issues surrounding the care of an affected child. PGD, importantly, could be understood as useful in helping people to prepare for that care. Instead of focusing on blame, she says, society should provide the framework for people to make responsible choices with respect to their own futures. We take as moral progress bringing the natural under social control. As such, compensation for arbitrary natural inequalities is a matter of human and moral progress. The obverse side of egalitarian compensation for undeserved bad luck is that people ought to bear the costs of what's preventable. And these involve problems of stigmatization and marginalization of people in society for, say, consciously making a choice to bring, say, a genetically anomalous child into existence. She mentioned, somebody named Anderson's lack of a safety net for those other than those who are a victim of brute bad luck or who prudently purchased private insurance. She discusses paternalism. She argues that forcing people to undergo PGD is not legitimately paternalistic, since paternalism is understood to provide the conditions for expanding choice. Finally, the concept of solidarity. She says, we risk creating a society where solidarity is only of the good and the prudent. Instead, solidarity should be based on our common humanity and the things necessary for everyone to lead a good life. These should be entitlements, she believes. Justice and solidarity have to do with a forward-looking policy of inclusion. The argument for solidarity is threefold, she says. First, freedom of choice presupposes a range of options. In order for choice to be free, the range of actual alternatives needs to be sufficiently broad. This means that certain choices must be supported by society. Second, not all options must be supported by society. Why is having a handicapped child not one of these? Because having children is a fundamental human good, she says. And finally, not infinitely. There is no bottomless pit here. It involves the support necessary for people to have a fair chance at life.